The exile's sorrow. The storm had passed, but the world still felt gray. Lyris pulled her tattered cloak tighter around her shoulders as she staggered through the unfamiliar valley, her legs aching with each step. The wind carried the scent of rain and distant fires, proof that civilization wasn't far. She had been wandering for weeks. She had lost everything. Her kingdom. Her people. Her honor. And now, she was nothing more than a ghost in a world that had long since forgotten her. The pain in her stomach sharpened. Hunger gnawed at her insides, and her vision swam from exhaustion. She had been surviving off scraps, avoiding roads where possible, always moving, always hiding. But she could not outrun the past. And soon, she would not be able to outrun death. As the hills sloped downward, she caught sight of a small village nestled between the trees. Smoke curled from chimneys, the scent of roasting meat carried on the breeze. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind warned her against it. This was a human settlement. And humans did not take kindly to outsiders like her. Still, what choice did she have? Lyris took a shaky breath and stepped forward, hoping that, just this once, fate would be kind. A village on edge. The village was quiet when she arrived. People moved about their daily routines, but their eyes flicked toward her with suspicion. A few mothers ushered their children inside, and a group of men at the marketplace exchanged wary glances. Lyris knew what they saw. A stranger in ragged armor. A warrior with no war to fight. She kept her head down, moving toward what looked like an inn. If she could just find shelter, perhaps a meal. A heavy hand grabbed her shoulder. "State your business," a gruff voice demanded. She turned slowly to face the man. He was broad-shouldered, clad in simple but sturdy clothes, and his stance made it clear that he was no stranger to violence. "I am only passing through," she said evenly, though her throat was dry. The man's eyes narrowed. "And yet, you are still standing here." She felt the weight of the village's gaze on her. She knew how this would go. Before she could speak, another voice interrupted. "She's with me." Lyris blinked. The crowd parted as a man strode toward them, wiping soot from his hands onto a smith's apron. His face was smudged with ash, his dark hair damp with sweat. He wasn't particularly imposing, but there was something steady in his gaze, something that spoke of quiet strength. The man beside her frowned. "Dorian, you know this woman?" Dorian hesitated, then nodded. "She's an old friend." Lyris stiffened. That was a lie. And yet, the man's grip on her shoulder loosened. "Fine," he muttered. "But if she causes trouble, it's on you." Dorian only nodded. Without another word, he gestured for her to follow. Still wary, but too tired to refuse, Lyris stepped after him. A blacksmith's kindness. Dorian's forge was warm, the scent of metal and burning coal thick in the air. He gestured for her to sit, then moved to a small wooden shelf, pulling out a loaf of bread and a piece of salted meat. "Eat," he said, setting them in front of her. Lyris hesitated. "Why are you helping me?" Dorian leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. "You looked like you needed it." She studied him. "I could be dangerous." "You could be." He shrugged. "But right now, you're just hungry." Lyris didn't argue. Instead, she took the food and ate in careful bites, savoring the warmth it brought to her hollow stomach. Dorian didn't press her with questions. He didn't ask where she was from, or why she looked like a woman who had lost a war. He simply let her exist. And for the first time in a long while, Lyris didn't feel like a ghost. The beginning of something more. That night, as the village settled into quiet, Lyris stood at the edge of the forge, staring up at the stars. She had not planned to stay. And yet, something about this place, about Dorian, made her hesitate. Perhaps it was the way he had helped her without asking for anything in return. Perhaps it was the way he had looked at her, not with fear, but with understanding. Or perhaps, deep down, she was simply tired of running. Either way, she knew one thing. For the first time in years, she felt like she had a reason to keep moving forward. And maybe, just maybe, this was where her new purpose would begin. A kindness undeserved. Lyris did not sleep. She was accustomed to keeping watch, to listening for the rustle of danger in the dark. Even in the safety of Dorian's forge, her instincts would not allow rest. She sat in the corner of the small space, watching the soft glow of embers in the forge's hearth. Outside, the village lay in stillness, but she could feel the undercurrent of unease. She did not belong here. Dorian had been foolish to help her. And yet, she was still here. The warmth of a full meal settled in her stomach, unfamiliar and unsettling in its own way. She was used to scraping by, used to eating only enough to keep herself from collapsing. The kindness of a stranger was not something she had anticipated, nor something she knew how to accept. She had spent too long surviving on her own. But now, she was no longer alone. And that, perhaps, was more dangerous than anything else. A village divided. By morning, the village had not forgotten her. Lyris could feel their stares as she stepped outside, adjusting the worn cloak around her shoulders. Murmurs rippled through the streets as she walked toward the well. Who is she? A mercenary, maybe. Or worse. We shouldn't be sheltering her. She ignored them. Words could not wound her. She had already lost everything. But as she filled a small water skin, a voice interrupted her thoughts. You shouldn't be here. Lyris turned. A woman stood behind her, arms crossed. Her dark eyes were sharp with suspicion, her posture stiff with warning. I mean no harm, Lyris said evenly. The woman scoffed. That's what all dangerous people say. Lyris said nothing. There was no argument to make. You might have Dorian fooled, but the rest of us aren't so trusting, the woman continued. We don't know who you are, where you came from, or what trouble follows you. And trouble always follows people like you. People like me. Lyris understood the warning. She had been in villages like this before, places that valued their peace above all else. Places where strangers were not welcome, no matter how desperate they were. Before she could respond, a familiar voice interrupted. That's enough, Mirren. Dorian approached, wiping soot from his hands. His expression was calm, but his tone left no room for argument. Mirren scowled. You're too trusting, Dorian. And you're too quick to judge, he replied. Lyris hasn't done anything wrong. Not yet. With a final glare, Mirren turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Dorian sighed. Don't take it personally. The people here, they've learned to be cautious. Lyris watched Mirren's retreating figure. They are right to be. Dorian studied her for a moment. You don't have to prove anything to them. Just, give it time. Time. Lyris wasn't sure she had that luxury. An old fear returns. The village was quiet that evening, but tension hummed beneath the surface. Lyris spent the day helping Dorian with simple tasks, carrying supplies, repairing tools, anything to earn her keep. The work was unfamiliar, but it gave her something to focus on other than the weight of unspoken accusations. Dorian never asked about her past. She was grateful for that. But peace, however fragile, never lasted. Just as dusk settled, the sound of hooves shattered the stillness. A group of riders approached the village, their armor gleaming in the fading light. Lyris stiffened. She knew that insignia. Warlord Malgren's men. Her blood turned cold. Dorian stepped beside her, his hand resting near the hammer at his belt. Friends of yours? Lyris exhaled slowly. Far from it. The riders dismounted, their leader scanning the gathered villagers with a calculating gaze. And then, his eyes landed on her. Well, the man drawled. I never expected to find the lost warrior of Ethar hiding in a place like this. The village erupted into murmurs. Lyris did not move. What do you want, Varric? Varric smirked. Is that any way to greet an old comrade? She clenched her fists. Varric had never been her comrade. He had been one of Malgren's lapdogs, a man who thrived on cruelty. I have no quarrel with you, she said carefully. Ah, but I have orders, Varric replied. Malgren is quite interested in finding his missing prize. Dorian tensed beside her. Prize? Varric's smile widened. Did she not tell you? This woman is no ordinary exile. She was once the fiercest warrior of the Etheri. And now, she's nothing but a traitor and a failure. Lyris forced herself to remain still. The villagers' gazes turned from wary to outright hostile. Varric spread his arms. So, here's the choice. You can come with me willingly, Lyris. Or, we can burn this place to the ground. The village held its breath. Lyris did not hesitate. She stepped forward. I will go. Dorian grabbed her arm. Lyris, don't. It's the only way, she murmured. Varric laughed. Ah, see? She's not completely heartless after all. But as he reached for her, Lyris moved. Faster than the eye could track, she grabbed Varric's wrist and twisted, sending him sprawling to the ground. In the same motion, she seized a fallen blade from one of his men and leveled it at his throat. Gasps echoed through the village. Varric's men drew their weapons. Lyris did not waver. This village has nothing to do with me, she said. Leave them out of it. Varric stared up at her, his smug expression darkening. You think you can protect them? Lyris pressed the blade closer. I know I can. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Varric chuckled. This isn't over. He gestured to his men. Reluctantly, they backed away. Lyris kept her stance firm as they mounted their horses and rode away, dust trailing behind them. Only when they had disappeared into the trees did she lower the blade. Silence hung over the village. And then, the whispers began again. She brought them here. She's dangerous. This will only bring more trouble. Lyris knew they were right. She turned to Dorian. I should leave. Dorian shook his head. No. You just saved them. They don't see it that way. He met her gaze. Then we'll make them see. Lyris had spent so long believing she did not deserve kindness. But as she looked at Dorian, she realized something. Maybe, she wasn't meant to do this alone. And maybe, just maybe, this was where her fight truly began. The truth revealed. The village did not sleep that night. Even though the warlord's men had ridden away, fear lingered in the air like smoke. The people whispered behind closed doors, peeking out of windows with expressions of suspicion and unease. Lyris sat in the forge, sharpening a blade. She had been a fool to think she could stay here. Dorian paced beside her. You saved them. They don't care, Lyris replied. Her voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the weariness in her tone. They only see what they want to see. They see a threat, Dorian admitted, running a hand through his hair. But they're wrong. Lyris shook her head. No. They aren't. Dorian frowned. Lyris set the blade down, staring into the flickering forge light. I never told you why Malgren's men are after me. Dorian pulled up a stool. Then tell me. For a long moment, she was silent. Then, she exhaled. And she told him everything. A warrior's past. She had been born into war. Her people, the Etheri, had been the last line of defense against Warlord Malgren's conquest. They were trained from childhood to fight, to kill, to win. Lyris had been one of the best. She had risen through the ranks, her blade carving a path through countless battles. She had been loyal, fierce, unbreakable. And then, she had been betrayed. Malgren took everything from me, she said. My people, my home. Her fingers curled into fists. He wanted me to serve him. To become his personal weapon. And when I refused, he made sure I had nowhere left to go. Dorian listened in silence. I was hunted, she continued. Everywhere I went, his men followed. Villages that helped me suffered for it. I learned to keep moving. To keep my head down. She exhaled slowly. I shouldn't have stayed here. Dorian leaned forward. You had nowhere else to go. Lyris shook her head. That doesn't matter. People like me don't get second chances. Dorian frowned. And what if you're wrong? She glanced at him. What if, he continued, this time is different? Lyris said nothing. Because deep down, she wanted to believe it. And that terrified her more than anything else. A village divided. By morning, the village was waiting. Lyris knew what was coming. A meeting. A decision. Dorian stood beside her as they walked to the village square, where the people had gathered. Mirren stepped forward. You should leave, she said bluntly. Lyris nodded. I know. Dorian scowled. She just saved your lives. Mirren's gaze did not waver. And she put us in danger to begin with. The villagers murmured in agreement. Lyris met Mirren's stare. I never meant to bring trouble here. But you did, Mirren replied. And it's only going to get worse. A heavy silence fell. Dorian clenched his fists. You're making a mistake. Mirren's expression softened, just slightly. Maybe. But we can't take the risk. Lyris exhaled. Then I'll go. Dorian turned to her. Lyris. It's the right choice, she said. Mirren stepped aside. The villagers parted, making a path to the gates. Lyris hesitated. Then, without another word, she walked away. And this time, she didn't look back. A choice made in fire. She made it to the tree line before she heard the screams. Lyris froze. Then, she turned. Smoke rose from the village. No. She ran. By the time she reached the square, chaos had erupted. Malgren's men had returned. And this time, they weren't just looking for her. They were here to destroy. Lyris didn't hesitate. She grabbed a fallen sword and charged. Her blade met steel, cutting through the enemy ranks like fire through dry grass. The villagers fought to defend themselves, but they were outmatched. Dorian swung his hammer, taking down one of the raiders. Lyris. She reached him. Get them to safety. I'm not leaving you. She didn't have time to argue. Varric stepped into the fray, a smirk on his lips. Still causing trouble? Lyris tightened her grip on her sword. You should have stayed gone. Varric lunged. Their blades clashed, sparks flying. Lyris moved with deadly precision, forcing him back. But Varric was not alone. A second attacker came from behind. Lyris barely dodged in time, but the strike left a deep gash on her side. She stumbled. Varric grinned. Looks like the legend is finally running out of luck. Lyris gritted her teeth. And then, Dorian was there. His hammer crashed into Varric's ribs, sending him sprawling. Lyris caught her breath. I told you to. You're terrible at listening, Dorian cut in. She almost laughed. But there was no time. The battle raged on, the village burning around them. And Lyris knew, this was the fight that would decide everything. The fire within. The village burned. Smoke choked the sky, casting an eerie orange glow over the battlefield. The screams of the wounded echoed between the flames, and the acrid scent of blood mixed with the burning wood. Lyris stood in the center of the chaos, her side bleeding, her sword gripped tightly in her hand. She had seen villages fall before. She had survived too many battles to count. But this time, it was different. Because this time, she wasn't fighting for herself. She was fighting for them. A warrior's resolve. Varric struggled to his feet, clutching his ribs where Dorian's hammer had struck. His smug expression had faltered, replaced by something colder. Annoyance. "I have to admit," he muttered, spitting blood onto the ground. "I thought you'd be broken by now." Lyris steadied her breathing. "You don't know me as well as you think." Varric smirked. "Oh, I know you." He wiped his mouth and gestured to the destruction around them. "This is what always happens, isn't it? No matter where you go, ruin follows." Lyris clenched her jaw. He was trying to shake her. But she wouldn't let him. Dorian stepped beside her, his hammer held at the ready. "You talk too much." Varric's eyes flicked to Dorian. "And you're a fool for standing beside her." Dorian shrugged. "Maybe. But I'd rather be a fool than a coward." Varric's smirk vanished. Then, without warning, he lunged. Lyris met him mid-strike. Steel clashed, the force sending tremors through her arms. She sidestepped his next blow, driving her elbow into his ribs before spinning and slashing downward. Varric barely dodged in time. Their fight was brutal, each strike faster than the last. But Lyris had spent years perfecting the art of war. And she was done running. With a final, precise movement, she knocked his blade aside and drove her knee into his chest, sending him crashing to the ground. Varric coughed, struggling to rise. Lyris stood over him, blade poised. "Yield," she ordered. Varric chuckled weakly. "You know Malgrin won't stop coming for you." Her grip tightened. "Then I'll stop him first." A slow grin spread across Varric's face. "I'd like to see you try." Before she could react, he slammed his boot into the ground, kicking up dirt and smoke. When it cleared, he was gone. Vanished into the chaos. Lyris cursed under her breath, scanning the battlefield. But she couldn't waste time chasing him. The village still needed her. A choice in the flames. Lyris and Dorian fought side by side, cutting down the remaining raiders. The villagers, inspired by their resistance, had taken up arms. They weren't warriors. But they were fighting for their home. And that was enough. One by one, Malgrin's men fell. The battle turned in their favor. And then, the last raider fled. Lyris didn't chase him. Instead, she turned to the village. The damage was worse than she had feared. Several homes were lost. Smoke still billowed from the wreckage, but at least they had survived. Mirren approached, her face grim. "Is it over?" she asked. Lyris exhaled. "For now." Mirren studied her for a long moment. Then, reluctantly, she nodded. "We owe you." Lyris shook her head. "You don't." Mirren's gaze softened. "Maybe not. But, thank you." The words were quiet, hesitant. But they meant something. Dorian clapped a hand on Lyris's shoulder. "See? Told you they'd come around." Lyris gave him a tired look. "They tolerated me for one day. That's not the same as trust." Dorian grinned. "It's a start." She huffed. But maybe, he was right. The fire within. That night, Lyris stood outside the forge, staring at the ruins of the village. Despite everything, she was still here. Still standing. She had spent so long believing she was cursed. That every place she touched was doomed to fall. But this time, they had fought back. And maybe she wasn't just a bringer of destruction. Maybe she could be something more. Dorian leaned against the wall beside her. Thinking about running again? Lyris smirked. Not yet. Dorian nodded. Good. For the first time in a long time, Lyris didn't feel like she was alone. And maybe, just maybe, she finally had something worth staying for. A warrior reborn. The village stood, scarred but unbroken. The fires had been extinguished, the wounded tended to, and the dead buried with honor. But an unshakable tension hung in the air, as if the people knew this peace was fragile, temporary. Malgrin wouldn't accept defeat. And Lyris knew she couldn't stay in the shadows any longer. A decision made. Lyris sat on the steps of the forge, sharpening her sword. The rhythmic scrape of metal on stone was soothing, steadying her thoughts. Dorian dropped onto the ground beside her, stretching his arms behind his head. So, he said, watching her work, what's next? She didn't answer immediately. Then, she exhaled. I need to end this. Dorian frowned. Malgrin? She nodded. He won't stop hunting me. And if I stay here, he'll burn this village to the ground. Dorian hesitated. You don't have to do this alone. Lyris shook her head. This isn't your fight. He scoffed. You think I care? She glanced at him. I've spent my whole life protecting this village, he said. But we both know that if Malgrin comes back with his full force, we won't stand a chance. Lyris frowned. You're saying we should take the fight to him? Dorian nodded. She considered it. It was dangerous. It was reckless. But it was their best chance. All right, she said finally. Then we need a plan. Gathering allies. Lyris and Dorian stood before the gathered villagers. Mirren was the first to speak. You want to attack Malgrin? Lyris nodded. If we wait, he'll strike again. We need to take the fight to him before he has the chance. The villagers murmured among themselves. Mirren crossed her arms. And you expect us to help? Dorian stepped forward. We don't expect anything. But if we don't fight, Malgrin will never stop. This village will never be safe. A heavy silence followed. Then, to Lyris's surprise, someone stepped forward. An older man, scarred from past battles. I fought in the last war, he said gruffly. I won't sit back and watch another tyrant rise. A younger woman stepped forward next. Neither will I. One by one, more villagers joined. By the end of the night, they had a small force, untrained, but determined. It wasn't much. But it was enough. The storm before the battle. They moved quickly. Lyris led them through the forest, toward one of Malgrin's outposts. It was a heavily guarded supply post, a key target. If they could take it, they could cripple Malgrin's forces before the real battle even began. As they approached, Dorian glanced at her. You ready for this? Lyris smirked. Always. The attack was swift, brutal. Lyris struck first, cutting through the guards like a shadow. The villagers fought beside her, their determination outweighing their inexperience. By dawn, the outpost was theirs. And Malgrin would know. There was no turning back now. The final stand. They stood on the cliffs overlooking Malgrin's fortress. Lyris felt the weight of the battle to come. Dorian stood beside her. Whatever happens, we end this today. She nodded. The sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. And with that first light, the battle for freedom began. The end, or the beginning,